The room went completely silent. Layla's hand froze on the door handle, the one she'd been about to push open with a tray of coffee and quarterly reports, when she heard his voice cut through the glass partition like a blade. Too dark. Honestly? She's too dark to ever be my wife. I need someone who looks the part. Laughter followed. Easy, careless, expensive laughter. She didn't drop the tray. She didn't cry. She just stood there in the hallway of the 42nd floor of Whitmore Capitol, her reflection staring back at her in the glass. Brown skin, natural hair pinned back, eyes that had just heard something they could never unhear, and made a decision so quiet it didn't even make a sound. He will never know he broke something in me today. And he will never know what he just lost. Hit that subscribe button and drop in the comments where you're watching from. Because the people who stay for this story, they're the ones who understand that being overlooked doesn't mean being invisible. It means the right person just hasn't looked yet. Jonah Whitmore did not wake up to alarm clocks. He woke up to the city. 42 stories below his floor-to-ceiling bedroom window, Chicago was already moving. Cabs cutting through gray morning mist, delivery trucks double-parked on Michigan Avenue, joggers threading the lakefront path like they had somewhere worth being. Jonah watched all of it from the edge of his bed, one hand wrapped around a mug of black coffee. His jaw set in that particular way his assistant had learned to read as "Do not speak to me yet." He was 34 years old. CEO of Whitmore Capital, a private equity firm his father had built and his grandfather had dreamed into existence from nothing. He had a penthouse, a Porsche, a place in the Hamptons he visited twice a year, and a face that magazines called quietly devastating. Sharp jaw, light brown eyes that flickered between warm and unreadable depending on the hour, hands that looked more suited for a boxing ring than a boardroom but had signed enough deals to reshape 3 industries. He also had rules. Not written ones. The kind that live in a man's chest, planted there by a father who believed image was currency and currency was survival. Whitmore men married women who elevated the brand. Women who photographed well at charity galas, who wore the right names on their dresses, who made other men slightly envious and other women quietly competitive. Jonah had never questioned this the way some men question things they've inherited, with anger or rebellion. He'd simply absorbed it, the way children absorb everything their fathers believe without meaning to teach them. He had dated women who fit the mold. 3 serious relationships, all of them beautiful in the specific way that gets noticed at fundraising dinners. All of them ending the same way, politely, mutually, without enough real pain to suggest either party had been truly present. He told himself that was maturity. He had never once considered it might be emptiness. His morning routine was precise. 45 minutes in the private gym on the 39th floor. Shower. A breakfast he barely tasted, egg whites, avocado, black coffee, while reading 3 newspapers and skimming 40 emails. Car at 7:45. At his desk by 8. His executive assistant Patrick had learned in his first week never to schedule anything before 8:15. That first 15 minutes was Jonah's, a ritual of stillness before the machine of the day started consuming him. On this particular Tuesday in November, Patrick had also learned something new. Do not let anyone near the conference room on the 42nd floor before 10. Because at 10, Jonah was meeting with the 3 men he'd known since Harvard, Brooks, Caleb, and Devereaux, for their quarterly off-the-record review. No agenda. No minutes taken. Just 4 men who trusted each other the way only men shaped by the same pressures and privileges can trust each other, completely, and with a blindness that occasionally bordered on cruelty. Layla Monroe arrived at Whitmore Capital at 7:15. Not because she had to. Her shift as a contracted hospitality coordinator didn't begin until 8. She arrived early because arriving early was the only form of control she had over a building that never fully felt like it wanted her in it. She was 28. Originally from Atlanta, Vine City specifically, a neighborhood that people from Buckhead only mentioned when they were explaining why they'd left Atlanta. She'd grown up in a house where the water bill and the light bill took turns being unpaid, where her mother worked double shifts at Grady Memorial and still came home to cook dinner because we don't do fast food in this house, baby, we don't have money to waste on sick. Layla had gotten a hospitality management degree from Georgia State, packed 2 suitcases, and moved to Chicago at 25 with a job offer and enough savings to last 3 months if she was careful. She had been careful. She had also been remarkable, quietly, stubbornly, in ways her supervisors noticed but rarely named out loud. She ran the executive floor's hospitality operations with a precision that made the 42nd floor function like a 5-star hotel. She remembered how every senior partner took their coffee. She anticipated catering needs before requests were made. She had once reorganized the entire quarterly meeting calendar after noticing a scheduling conflict no one else had caught, and received a thank-you email from the CFO that she printed out and kept in her nightstand drawer. Not because she needed validation. Because in a building full of people who looked through her, it was proof she existed. She was not naive about what she was in this building. She had felt it from the first week, the particular quality of invisibility that descends on a black woman in a predominantly white corporate space when she is not in a position of obvious power. The way conversations paused when she entered rooms and resumed like she hadn't. The way certain men looked at her with a flicker of interest that immediately corrected itself into professional neutrality, as though they'd caught themselves doing something embarrassing. The way women with less competence moved through the same building with a frictionless ease that Layla had to work 3 times as hard to approximate. She had learned to make her armor invisible too. Smile that lands just short of warm. Posture that says I belong here even when the room disagrees. A voice calibrated to be heard without being labeled aggressive. A habit of entering rooms like she had been expected, because the alternative, the hesitation, the apologetic knock, gave people permission to treat her like a question instead of an answer. She was stunning, though she would have laughed softly and deflected if anyone said so directly. Dark brown skin that caught light like it had its own opinion about luminosity. Deep-set eyes with a gravity to them that made people feel, when she looked at them directly, that she was reading something true about them. She kept her natural hair, thick, coiled, deliberately unstraightened, because she had tried the other way for 2 years in her early 20s, and it had felt like wearing someone else's face. She was not angry. She was tired in the way that people who have been strong for a long time get tired, not broken, just aware of the weight. At 9:58, Layla loaded the hospitality cart for the executive conference room. 4 coffees. Brooks took his with oat milk, Caleb liked it black with 1 sugar, Devereux preferred a flat white, and Jonah Whitmore took his black, no sugar. Temperature held at exactly 185 degrees because Patrick had included that detail in the hospitality brief like it was a national security concern. She had never spoken directly to Jonah Whitmore. She had seen him, in the way you see weather, powerful and impersonal. He moved through the 42nd floor with the particular authority of a man who had never needed to announce himself. She had noticed, clinically, that he was attractive. She had also noticed, clinically, that he was the kind of man who did not notice her the way she noticed him, not because she wanted him to, but because she was accustomed to existing in the peripheral vision of men like him. She pushed the cart down the hallway at 10:02. The conference room glass was partially frosted, but sound carried. She heard the laughter first. Then the voice, his voice, low and unhurried, the voice of a man who had never had to choose his words carefully because his words had never cost him anything. Too dark. Honestly? She's too dark to ever be my wife. I need someone who looks the part. More laughter. Layla stood in the hallway. Her hand on the door handle. Her reflection in the glass, a woman looking at herself from the outside. She breathed in once. Breathed out slow. Then she opened the door, set each coffee down with perfect precision, made eye contact with no one, and left the room so quietly that none of the 4 men could have said with certainty that she had ever been there. She made it to the service corridor before her hands started shaking. She pressed her back against the cold wall, tilted her head up toward the ceiling, and blinked, once, twice, until the burning behind her eyes retreated. He doesn't know you, she told herself. He doesn't know you. He doesn't know what you're made of. He doesn't get to. She pushed off the wall, straightened her jacket, and went back to work. Because that was what Layla Monroe did with the things that tried to break her. She carried them quietly, and she kept moving, and she never, not once, let them see her stumble. But something had shifted in her chest in that hallway. Something small and permanent. And neither of them knew yet that the universe had heard it. Subscribe, drop a like, and tell us in the comments, has anyone ever really seen you? Because you deserve to be seen too. 3 days passed. Layla did what she always did with pain that had no safe address. She folded it small, tucked it somewhere beneath her sternum, and kept showing up. Wednesday. Thursday. Friday. She made the coffees. She managed the catering orders. She restocked the executive floor pantry and coordinated a last-minute lunch for 12 when the CFO's assistant dropped the ball on a client meeting. She did all of it with the same quiet precision that made her indispensable in a building that would never think to call her that. She did not think about what she'd heard. Or rather, she thought about it the way you think about a bruise. You don't press it on purpose. But you always know exactly where it is. The thing about Jonah Whitmore was that he was not, in the way that truly cruel men are cruel, a bad person. That was almost the worst part. He was the product of a particular kind of formation, prep school, Harvard, a father who loved him in the language of expectation and whose approval had always come attached to conditions. He had been taught that the world sorted itself into categories, and that a Whitmore's job was to occupy the right ones. He had absorbed this so early and so completely that he no longer experienced it as belief. It simply felt like reality. He did not think of himself as a man who held harmful ideas. He thought of himself as a man with standards. There is a particular blindness that lives inside that distinction, and Jonah Whitmore had never once been made to look at it directly. Until the Friday after the conference room. It started with a file. Jonah was in his office at 6:45 in the evening, the floor mostly empty, the city outside his window shifting from amber to violet, when he reached for the Henderson account brief and knocked an entire cup of cold coffee directly onto his keyboard, his laptop, and the signed original of a contract that represented $11 million in pending negotiations. He said something that would have surprised people who only knew his boardroom voice. Then he grabbed his phone to call Patrick, and remembered Patrick had left at 5 because Jonah had told him to, because Patrick had a daughter turning 6 and Jonah was not, whatever else he was, a man who kept fathers from their children's birthday parties. He stood up, looked at the spreading dark stain on the contract pages, made a rapid calculation about dry time, scanner availability, and whether the document was salvageable. Then he did something he almost never did. He walked out of his office and down the hall to find someone to help him. The 42nd floor was quiet in the specific way that expensive places get quiet after hours. The hum of climate control, the distant percussion of the elevator, the city's glow pressing softly against the glass. Most of the staff had gone. The cleaning crew wouldn't arrive until 8. He pushed open the door to the hospitality prep room without knocking, because it never occurred to him to knock on a door in his own building, and stopped. Layla was there. She was standing at the counter with her back to him, earbuds in, moving slightly to whatever she was listening to while she restocked the cabinet with methodical efficiency. She hadn't heard him come in. She was wearing her work uniform, dark slacks, white button-down, but her hair was down now, free from the pin she wore during service hours, and it fell around her shoulders in thick, natural coils that caught the warm overhead light in a way that made Jonah go momentarily, inexplicably still in the doorway. He cleared his throat. She turned. The moment she saw him, the easy rhythm of her movement stopped. Something behind her eyes went careful and professional with a speed that, if Jonah had been paying the kind of attention he wasn't yet capable of paying, would have told him everything about how she experienced this building. She pulled out one earbud. Mr. Whitmore. Her voice was level, warm without being welcoming. The voice of a woman who had calibrated herself perfectly for this exact kind of encounter. I didn't realize anyone was still on the floor. Is there something you need? I spilled coffee on the Henderson contract. He said it matter-of-factly, the way men used to getting things solved say things. It's an original signature. I need to know if there's anything in here that can pull ink back from wet paper without destroying it. Layla looked at him for exactly 1 beat longer than necessary. Then she moved. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. She crossed to the supply cabinet on the far wall, scanned it with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what was in it, and pulled out a document preservation kit, the kind kept on hand for exactly these moments, that she had requisitioned 3 months ago after a similar incident with the COO and a glass of sparkling water. Bring me the contract, she said. You can just tell me what to. The longer it sits, the more the ink bleeds. She looked at him directly. Bring me the contract, Mr. Whitmore. Something in her tone, not rude, not soft, simply absolute, made him turn around and go get it without another word. He returned in 90 seconds with the damp pages held carefully apart. She had already cleared the counter and laid down a clean pressing cloth. She took the contract from him, her fingers briefly near his, neither of them acknowledging it, and began to work. Jonah stood across the counter and watched her. She applied a fine mist of document preservative with the focus of someone diffusing something delicate. Her hands were steady and precise. She laid each page flat with careful, deliberate movements, checking the ink spread under the counterlight, adjusting pressure with the edge of a soft cloth. You've done this before, he said. Mr. Caldwell. Sparkling water. Q3 last year. She didn't look up. You were in the Hamptons. He paused. You remember that? It's my job to remember things on this floor. A brief pause. Most of them, anyway. There was something in the way she said most of them, a slight, almost imperceptible shift in cadence, that snagged in Jonah's chest without him understanding why. He watched her work in silence for a moment. Will it survive? She tilted one page carefully toward the light, examined it, set it back down. The ink is stable on the main body. The signature on page 4 has some bleeding on the lower loop, but it's still legible and legally identifiable. She straightened up and looked at him. It'll survive. He exhaled. Thank you. She nodded once, already beginning to clean up, closing the kit, folding the pressing cloth, restoring order with the same efficiency she'd brought to everything. What's your name? He asked. The question landed differently than he intended. Or maybe exactly as he intended, and he hadn't examined why. She looked at him again with that quality of directness that made people feel red. Layla Monroe. I manage hospitality operations on this floor. A beat. I've been here 14 months. The implication was quiet and devastating, and she delivered it without raising her voice by a single degree. 14 months. Same floor. And you don't know my name. Jonah felt it land. He wasn't sure he could have explained exactly what it was, but something registered, a recognition of a gap he hadn't known existed until she'd just wordlessly shown it to him. Layla, he said, testing the weight of it, though he didn't realize that's what he was doing. Good night, Mr. Whitmore. She picked up her bag from the hook by the door. The pages need 2 hours to fully set before you handle them. I'd leave them on the counter. She walked past him toward the door. Ms. Monroe. She stopped. Didn't turn fully. Just angled her head slightly, giving him the edge of her profile. Thank you, he said again. And this time it carried something different, not the efficient gratitude of a CEO to a service employee. Something less practiced. Something that surprised even him as it came out. Layla turned just enough to look at him one full second. Take care of that contract, she said quietly. And then she was gone. Jonah stood alone in the hospitality prep room for a long moment after the door closed. He looked down at the pages drying on the counter, saved, steady, legible. Then he looked at the door. Then, without fully understanding the impulse, he tried to remember if he had ever, in 14 months, once looked directly at the woman who had just saved $11 million with a preservation kit she'd had the foresight to order before he'd ever thought to ask for it. He couldn't remember. And for the first time in longer than he could name, Jonah Whitmore felt something that his life had been very carefully constructed to prevent him from feeling. Small. He went back to his office. Sat down at his desk. Stared at the city. And heard from somewhere in the back of his mind, the place where things you've said live longer than you want them to. His own voice, easy and careless and surrounded by expensive laughter. Too dark. She's too dark to ever be my wife. He didn't know she'd heard it. He didn't know that the woman who had just stood across a counter from him and saved his contract with steady hands and a voice like quiet thunder was the same woman his words had been about. He didn't know any of it yet. But something in his chest had shifted, small and permanent, in a way that mirrored, without his knowledge, the exact shift that had happened in hers 3 days ago in a hallway. The universe, it seemed, had noted both of them. And it was just getting started. Jonah Whitmore was not a man who got distracted. This was not discipline so much as design. His mind had been built, over years of high-stakes negotiation and inherited pressure, to move in straight lines. Problem. Analysis. Solution. The emotional static that derailed other men, nostalgia, longing, the particular haunting quality of an unfinished conversation, had never found much purchase in him. Which was why the following Monday morning, when he caught himself looking up from a merger proposal worth $63 million because someone in the hallway had a laugh that made him think of Layla Monroe, he recognized it as something worth paying attention to. Not because it was welcome. Because it was new. He told himself it was gratitude. The contract had survived. The Henderson deal was back on track. He owed her a proper acknowledgement, something more formal than the stunned thank you he'd offered in the hospitality prep room on Friday night. That was all this was. Professional courtesy. The kind of thing his mother had raised him to practice regardless of the dynamics of the room. He called Patrick into his office at 8:17. "The hospitality coordinator on this floor," he said, keeping his voice at its boardroom register. "Monroe. Layla Monroe. Pull her employment file and put a gift card on my desk, something appropriate. She saved the Henderson contract Friday night." Patrick, who had worked for Jonah for 3 years and had developed a highly calibrated internal radar for the difference between his boss's routine requests and the ones that meant something was shifting, made a note without expression. "How much for the gift card?" Jonah considered. "Whatever's appropriate." "I'll need a number, sir." "Then use your judgment, Patrick. That's what I pay you for." Patrick left. Jonah looked back at the merger proposal. Read the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing a single word. The file arrived at 9. He told himself he was only reading it to confirm the gift amount was appropriate. To know enough about her role to write a proper acknowledgement note. Basic professional diligence. Layla Christine Monroe. Age 28. Atlanta, Georgia. Georgia State University, B.S. Hospitality Management. Graduated with honors. Contracted through Prestige Executive Services. Placed at Whitmore Capital 14 months ago. Performance reviews. Exceptional across all categories. Noted commendations from CFO Raymond Okafor, Senior Partner David Lim, and 3 separate executive assistants. He read the commendation from Raymond Okafor twice. Ms. Monroe identified a scheduling conflict in Q2 that would have placed our largest institutional client in a meeting room simultaneously with a competing firm. Her intervention prevented what could have been a significant relationship liability. Her attention to detail and discretion are assets this floor relies on heavily. Jonah set the file down. Picked it up again. There was a small headshot in the top corner, the kind taken for corporate ID badges, flat lighting, neutral background, the sort of photo designed to reduce a person to their most administrative version of themselves. It didn't work on Layla Monroe. Even in a badge photo, there was something in her expression, a quality of composure that somehow read simultaneously as warmth and warning, like a door that was open but aware of itself, that made the image feel more alive than it had any bureaucratic right to be. Subscribe, drop a like, and tell us in the comments, has anyone ever really seen you? Because you deserve to be seen too. Jonah closed the file, placed it face down on his desk, and went back to the merger proposal with the focused intentionality of a man trying very hard not to think about something specific. Layla, for her part, had spent the weekend doing what she always did when something got under her skin. She called her best friend, Deja. Deja Washington had known Layla since their sophomore year at Georgia State, had moved to Chicago 2 years after Layla, and currently worked as a pediatric nurse at Rush University Medical Center with the same combination of fierce competence and loving exasperation that characterized everything she did. She was also, as she frequently reminded Layla, the only person in Layla's life allowed to say the things Layla wouldn't say about herself. They were on the phone for 47 minutes Saturday morning while Layla made tea and Deja folded laundry, and the whole story came out. The conference room, the words, the shaking hands in the service corridor, the Friday night encounter, 14 months. When Layla finished, there was a pause. "He said she's too dark to be his wife," Deja said slowly, in the voice she used when she was deciding which version of herself to deploy. "Yes." "And then 3 days later he's standing in your prep room looking at you like." "He wasn't looking at me like anything, Deja. He needed help with a document." "Layla." "He didn't even know my name. Layla Christine Monroe." "Don't." "I'm just saying." Deja's voice shifted, softer now, the version that didn't need to perform. "How did it feel when he said your name the second time?" Layla was quiet for a moment. The tea kettle started to whistle. "Like something I didn't ask for," she said finally. Deja understood that completely. "So what are you going to do?" "My job," Layla said. "I'm going to do my job." She was doing her job on Monday morning when Patrick appeared at the hospitality prep room door at 10:15 with an envelope and the slightly uncomfortable expression of a man delivering something he'd been given no context for. "From Mr. Whitmore," he said. "For Friday." Layla took the envelope. Waited until Patrick left to open it. Inside was a gift card to a restaurant she recognized immediately. Oriole, 2 Michelin stars, the kind of place that required reservations 3 months in advance and where a dinner for 2 cost more than her monthly car payment. And beneath it, a handwritten note on Whitmore Capital stationery. Not a printed card. Handwritten. Ms. Monroe, your professionalism and foresight on Friday evening prevented a significant business liability. The Henderson contract is intact. That was entirely due to your preparation and your calm. I'm grateful. J. Whitmore. Layla read it twice. She noted the handwriting, deliberate, slightly forward-leaning, the penmanship of a man who'd been taught to write properly and had maintained the habit. She noted the word calm. She noted that he had not written "thank you for your service" or any of the other phrases that would have placed her neatly back in her designated role. He had written "you're calm," like it was a thing worth naming. She put the note back in the envelope, put the envelope in her bag, and told herself it didn't mean anything. She almost believed it until Tuesday afternoon. She was setting up for a 3 o'clock catering delivery in the executive lounge when she heard footsteps and looked up to find Jonah Whitmore in the doorway, not passing through, not reaching for coffee, simply standing there with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the forearm in the way that meant he'd been in back-to-back meetings since morning. He looked, she thought before she could stop herself, tired in a human way. Not the performative exhaustion of important men who mention their schedules the way other people mention the weather. Actually tired. Like something was sitting heavy on him. Ms. Monroe. He stepped into the lounge, moved toward the coffee station, then stopped and seemed to make a decision. Can I ask you something? Layla straightened slowly. Of course. The scheduling conflict you caught in Q2. He said it directly, no preamble. The Rothwell-Mercer overlap. Raymond mentioned it in a meeting this morning and I realized I never, he paused, and the pause had something genuine in it. I never acknowledged that directly. That was significant. You protected a client relationship that took us 3 years to build. Layla looked at him steadily. It was my job to notice it. It was your job to manage coffee and catering. His voice wasn't harsh, it was honest, and that was somehow more affecting. What you did was beyond that. I should have said something at the time. The room was quiet. Layla felt the familiar internal negotiation, the one she'd been running her entire professional life, between the part of her that wanted to deflect graciously and move on, and the part that was so tired of making men comfortable with their own oversight. She let the silence breathe for 1 beat longer than was professionally comfortable. Thank you for saying so, she said finally. Mr. Whitmore. She turned back to the catering setup. He didn't leave immediately. She could feel him still in the room, not threateningly, not inappropriately. Just present in the way that people are present when they're deciding whether to say the thing they actually came to say. Did you get the envelope? He asked. I did. Was it, another pause. Was it appropriate? She kept her hands moving, aligning the napkin folds with deliberate focus. Oriole has a 14-week reservation waitlist. I know someone. Of course you do. It came out quieter than she intended. Not bitter, just real. She heard him exhale, a small, almost inaudible sound that could have been a laugh or could have been something else entirely. Ms. Monroe. His voice had changed register, lower, less boardroom, more human. I feel like I've been very bad at seeing the people on this floor. And I'm not entirely sure when that happened. Layla's hands stilled on the napkins. She turned around slowly and looked at him across the room. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, open in a way his face didn't usually allow itself to be. Like something behind the architecture of his composure had shifted slightly, letting light through a crack it hadn't planned on. It was the most dangerous thing he'd shown her yet. Because Layla Monroe, who had built very good walls for very good reasons, felt something move in her chest that she immediately, firmly, pressed back down. No, she told herself clearly. You know what he said. You know exactly who he is when he thinks no one is listening. We all have blind spots, she said carefully. The important thing is what we do when we find them. She held his gaze for exactly the right amount of time. Then she picked up the catering tray and moved past him toward the conference room. He watched her go. And for the second time in less than a week, Jonah Whitmore stood alone in a room she just left and felt the specific, unfamiliar discomfort of a man who is beginning to understand that he has been measuring the wrong things. What he didn't know couldn't know, standing in the executive lounge with the city gray and quiet outside the glass, was that Brooks had talked. Not maliciously. Brooks was not a malicious man. He was simply the kind of man who treated conversation like a contact sport and had no awareness of the damage his words left behind. He had mentioned, at a dinner Thursday night, in the presence of his girlfriend Simone and her friend Kezia, who worked in Whitmore Capital's HR-adjacent consulting division, that Jonah had made a hilarious comment about dating standards at their Monday meeting. Simone had not found it hilarious. Kezia, whose desk was 3 floors below the 42nd, had found it something else entirely. By Wednesday morning, the words had traveled a specific route that words travel in buildings full of people who interact across invisible hierarchies, quietly, quickly, with a particular momentum of something that confirms what people already suspected. By Wednesday afternoon, Layla Monroe heard them again. Not from a glass partition this time. From Amara in accounting, who sat across from Kezia, who had said it with the careful gentleness of someone who thinks you deserve to know something even though the knowing will hurt. Apparently he said it about you specifically, Layla. Someone who fits your description. From the conference room. Monday of last week. Layla sat very still at the break room table. The coffee in front of her went cold. Of course, she thought. Of course it was specific. She had half convinced herself, in the days since the prep room and the envelope and the "you're calm" and the way he'd said her name, she had half convinced herself that she had been wrong to wall herself off. That people were capable of growth. That the man she'd spoken to over a drying contract and a catering setup was more complex than the careless voice she'd heard through the glass. She had let herself wonder, just barely, just at the edges. And now she knew. She hadn't been wrong to build the wall. She had been wrong to start looking at the door. She requested a floor transfer the next morning. The request sat in the system for 6 hours before Patrick, whose job it was to flag anything on the 42nd floor that required attention, saw it. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he walked to Jonah's office door, knocked twice, and said, in the carefully neutral tone of a man who suspected he was delivering a grenade, "Sir, Layla Monroe has submitted a request to transfer off the executive floor." Jonah looked up from his desk. Something moved across his face, quick, unguarded, gone before it fully formed. "When?" he asked. "This morning." A silence. "Don't process it yet," Jonah said. Patrick nodded and left. Jonah sat back in his chair and looked at the city, the same view, the same glass, the same Chicago gray and gold pressing against the window, and felt something he hadn't expected to feel about a transfer request from a hospitality coordinator. He felt like he was losing something. Something he hadn't known he had until it was already walking toward the door. She found out. And she's doing the only thing that makes sense, protecting herself from a man whose words already drew blood once. But here's what's breaking us right now: he doesn't know she heard him. And she doesn't know he's already changing. Subscribe, drop a like, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Jonah did not process the transfer request. He also did not call Layla into his office, did not send another envelope, did not ask Patrick to intervene on his behalf in any of the ways that powerful men intervene when they want something stopped without having to explain why they want it stopped. He did something harder. He waited. Not because he had a plan, but because somewhere between reading her file and standing in the executive lounge watching her walk away with a catering tray held like a shield, he had developed enough self-awareness to know that the next move could not be his. That he had, in ways he was only beginning to map, already taken up too much space in a story that wasn't about him. So he waited. And on Thursday morning, he got on the elevator at 7:58, and Layla Monroe got on at the lobby level at 7:59, and the doors closed before either of them could make a different choice. The elevator at Whitmore Capital was the kind that moved fast and didn't announce its intentions. No music, no mirror, just brushed steel walls and a floor indicator that climbed in clean green increments. It fit 4 people comfortably. With 2 people and the specific atmospheric pressure of everything unspoken between them, it felt considerably smaller. Layla was in her work uniform. Hair pinned. Armor fully assembled. She looked at the floor indicator when he stepped in. He looked at it too. 411 floors, they said nothing. Then Jonah said quietly, to the brushed steel wall in front of him, "You requested a transfer." "Yes." Her voice gave nothing away. "Can I ask why?" A pause that lasted exactly the length of time it takes a person to decide whether honesty is worth the exposure. "I think we both know why, Mr. Whitmore." The elevator stopped at 38. No one got on. The doors closed. They continued rising. Jonah turned to look at her profile. She was still watching the floor indicator, jaw set, the particular stillness of someone who has decided in advance not to be moved. "You heard what I said," he said. "Not a question." In the conference room. The number climbed. 39. 40. Yes, she said. One word. The flattest, most devastating single syllable he had heard in his adult life. The elevator reached 42. The doors opened. Neither of them moved for exactly 3 seconds, a brief, suspended moment that felt much longer, the way moments do when something irreversible is deciding which direction to fall. Then Layla stepped out, and Jonah stepped out behind her, and instead of turning left toward his office he said her name. Layla. Not Ms. Monroe. Layla. She stopped walking. Didn't turn around. Not here, she said, low enough that only he could hear it. Not in the middle of this floor. Then where? A long pause. The prep room. After close. If you still want to have this conversation. She started walking again. I'll be there until 7. He was there at 6:53. The hospitality prep room after hours had a different quality than during the day, quieter, warmer, stripped of its functional urgency. The overhead fluorescents had been dimmed to their evening setting, and the counter where she'd saved the Henderson contract was clean and bare. Layla was restocking the far cabinet when he came in, and this time she heard him, turned before he could announce himself, leaned back against the counter with her arms crossed loosely, not defensively, but in the way of someone who needed to feel their own solidity before beginning something difficult. Jonah closed the door behind him. He didn't go to the opposite counter or put space between them the way men do when they want to signal safety. He stood a few feet inside the door and looked at her directly and said the thing with no boardroom between them. I'm sorry. Layla looked at him. What I said was wrong, he continued. It was shallow and it was cruel, and it was the kind of thing I should have examined in myself long before it ever reached my mouth. I don't have an excuse for it. I'm not going to offer you one. The room was very quiet. You said it to your friends, she said. Easy. Like it cost you nothing. Like it was just an opinion about whether. I know. Do you know what it costs? Her voice didn't rise. It went lower, which was somehow worse. The sound of something speaking from deep in the place where it had been stored. To come into a building like this every day and do your job with everything you have and be extraordinary at it, and still know, just know, that to certain people in certain rooms you will always be too something. Too loud or too much or too, she stopped. Steadied. Too dark. Jonah didn't look away. I know that I can't fully understand what that costs, he said quietly. I won't pretend to. But I want you to know that I heard you. What you just said, I heard it. Layla studied him across the room the way she studied things that required careful handling. Why didn't you process the transfer? She asked. Because I didn't want you to leave. The honesty of it sat between them without decoration. That's not a good enough reason, she said. That's about what you want. You're right. He said it immediately without defensiveness, and she registered that, the speed of it, the absence of ego in it. A better answer is that you are exceptional at what you do, and this floor functions better because of you, and you should not have to leave a space you've built and maintained and protected because of something careless, I said. A pause. But if you want to transfer, if that's what makes this building feel safe again, I will process it myself and I will write you a commendation that gets you onto any floor in this city. Layla was quiet for a long moment. Something in her chest was doing complicated things. Sit down, Mr. Whitmore, she said finally. He sat on the stool at the end of the counter. She stayed leaning against the far counter, arms still crossed, but something in her posture had shifted, fractionally, almost imperceptibly. Like a door that hasn't opened but has acknowledged the knock. Where did it come from? She asked. That kind of thinking. Because men like you don't just wake up with it. Someone taught you. Jonah was quiet for a moment that had genuine weight to it. And then, in the dimmed hospitality prep room of the 42nd floor, he did something he had not done in recent memory. Not with Brooks or Caleb or Devereux, not with the women he dated, not with his therapist whom he'd stopped seeing 18 months ago because he convinced himself he didn't need the room anymore. He told the truth. My father, he said, had a very specific idea of what a Whitmore woman looked like. He never said it in the language I used. He said it in invitations, who got brought to family dinners, who got introduced to the club, who got the weight of his approval when I walked in with her on my arm. He never had to explain the criteria. I just learned them. The way kids learn everything their fathers believe, by watching what makes the man relax. He looked down at his hands. I never questioned it because it never felt like cruelty. It felt like taste. Standards. I told myself there's nothing wrong with knowing what you want. A pause. I didn't understand that what I wanted had been handed to me by someone else's fear, and I'd just been carrying it around like it was mine. Layla was very still. What was he afraid of? She asked quietly. Jonah looked up at her. Honestly? I think he was afraid of anything that couldn't be controlled. Anything that didn't fit the frame. And dark-skinned black women, women who look like you, don't fit the frame that men like my father built their whole world inside. His jaw tightened slightly. Which says everything about the frame and nothing about the women. The room breathed. That might be the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me in this building, Layla said. It might be the most honest thing I've said to myself in years. She uncrossed her arms, moved to the stool on the opposite end of the counter and sat, not close, but no longer across the room. The distance between them now was conversational rather than territorial. Vine City, she said. That's where I'm from. Atlanta. You know what Vine City is. I know of it. It's the kind of neighborhood that people describe with a pause before it. A small, dry lift at the corner of her mouth. My mother worked doubles at Grady Memorial for 22 years. She raised me and my brother on a nurse's salary in a neighborhood where the grocery store was a 40-minute bus ride, and the school counselor told me sophomore year that I should consider trade programs. She said it without anger, the flat, weathered tone of a woman who has long since converted old wounds into fuel. I graduated with honors. Got a full academic scholarship. Moved to Chicago at 25 with 2 suitcases and 3 months of savings. By yourself. My mother cried for a week. A real smile now, brief, warm, transformative. Then she packed me jerk chicken for the drive and told me not to let anybody make me small. Jonah looked at her, really looked, the way he was only just learning to do. Did they, he asked, make you small? Layla considered this with the seriousness the question deserved. They tried, she said. And I won't pretend it didn't leave marks. But small. She shook her head slowly. No. My mother didn't work 22 doubles for small. Something moved across Jonah's face, unguarded and genuine and too quick to perform. She sounds extraordinary, he said. She's the strongest person I've ever known. A pause. She was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's 8 months ago. The room changed. Layla. She's doing well. She's stubborn in the best way. Her voice was steady, but Jonah heard the thing underneath the steadiness, the particular frequency of a person who has been holding fear in their body for so long they've integrated it into their posture. It's why I've been doing overtime. The specialist in Atlanta isn't cheap and her insurance has gaps. She said it matter-of-factly, without bid for sympathy, the way people who have real problems talk about them. Anyway. Jonah had never heard a word carry so much quiet dignity. Is that why you stay late? He asked. The overtime. That's why I stay late. He thought about Friday night. Her earbuds in, moving to music in an empty building at 6:45, restocking cabinets in the low light. Not because she loved the work. Because she loved her mother. He felt something in his chest crack open along a seam he hadn't known was there. Can I tell you something I've never said out loud? He asked. Layla looked at him with those eyes that read things accurately. If you want to, she said. I don't know how to want the things I actually want. He said it slowly, like a man discovering the sentence as he speaks it. I know how to want things I've been told to want. The right firm, the right address, the right everything. I've been optimizing for a life that was designed by someone else and calling it ambition. A long exhale. And I'm 34 years old and I come home to a penthouse that feels like a hotel, and I've dated 3 women who were perfect on paper, and I felt nothing. Not nothing, but not enough. Never enough. Layla was quiet. What do you feel right now? She asked carefully. The question was not romantic in its delivery. It was the question of someone who had spent enough time being unseen that she had learned to value exactness. Jonah looked at her steadily. Like I'm in a room I didn't know existed, he said. And I'm not sure how I went 34 years without finding it. They stayed in the prep room until 8:47. They talked about her brother Terrence, who was studying architecture at Howard. They talked about Jonah's mother, a quiet, warm woman from Tennessee who had married into the Whitmore world and spent 30 years gracefully, privately disagreeing with most of what it stood for. They talked about Chicago in November, and the lake, and the way the city looked from the 42nd floor at a certain hour when the lights were just beginning to outshine the last of the daylight. They talked the way people talk when they've stopped performing. At 8:47, Layla looked at her phone and stood up. "I have to catch the L," she said. Jonah stood too. "Let me." "No." She said it gently, but without negotiation. "Not yet." He understood. And the fact that he understood, that he didn't push, didn't leverage, didn't use any of the considerable resources at his disposal to override her not yet, was perhaps the most significant thing he'd done in the entire evening. "Okay," he said. She gathered her bag. Moved to the door. "Layla." His voice was quiet. She paused with her hand on the door handle, a gesture that echoed, without either of them knowing it, the moment she'd stood in the hallway 6 days ago with her hand on a different door handle and heard something that had tried to take something from her. This time when she turned, there was no glass between them. "Thank you," he said. "For staying. For telling me." She looked at him in the warm low light of the prep room, this man who was cracked open and undefended and nothing like the boardroom figure she'd been invisible to for 14 months, and felt the thing she'd been pressing down rise quietly to the surface. Not forgiveness yet. Not trust yet. But something. The particular something that happens when a wall doesn't come down but a window opens in it, small and real, and full of the terrifying possibility of air. "Don't waste it," she said softly. And she walked out into the night. Jonah stood alone in the prep room. For a long time. Then he took out his phone and called his mother in Tennessee, something he hadn't done without a calendar prompt in over a year. She answered on the second ring. "Jonah." Her voice was warm and unhurried the way his father's never was. "It's late, baby. You okay?" "Yeah," he said. And then, because the evening had apparently disassembled whatever mechanism usually filtered these things, "Mom, did Dad ever tell you what kind of woman he wanted you to be before he let himself love you?" A pause on the line. "Oh, honey," she said quietly. "That's a big question for a Thursday night." "I know." "Then you'd better sit down," she said. "Because the answer is yes. And the story of how I made him unlearn it took about 3 years and a lot of grace." Jonah sat down on the prep room stool. Outside, 42 floors below, Layla Monroe was walking toward the L station with her coat pulled against the November wind, her mother's voice in her memory saying, "Don't let anybody make you small," and something in her chest that felt, cautiously, frighteningly, like the first molecule of hope she'd allowed herself in a very long time. 3 weeks passed. And in those 3 weeks, something quiet and irreversible happened between Jonah Whitmore and Layla Monroe, the way seasons change, not in a single dramatic moment but in the accumulation of small undeniable shifts that you only fully recognize when you look back and realize the air is completely different from what it was. He started noticing things. Not in the way he'd been trained to notice things, categorically, evaluatively, through the inherited lens of what fit and what didn't, but in the way that people notice things when they've stopped curating their attention and started simply paying it. He noticed that she took her lunch at 12:30 instead of noon because the break room was less crowded and she used the quiet to call her mother. He noticed that she kept a small succulent on the prep room windowsill that she brought from home, deep green, quietly thriving, incongruously alive in a corporate building. He noticed that when she laughed, really laughed, not the professional approximation she deployed in client-facing moments, it arrived without warning and left the room feeling warmer than it had been. He noticed that he was rearranging his schedule, in small and mostly deniable ways, to be on the 42nd floor at 12:45. They had fallen into something that neither of them had named. Coffee that lingered past its functional purpose. Conversations that started with building logistics and ended somewhere near philosophy. A Tuesday afternoon when the November rain came sideways against the floor-to-ceiling windows and they stood side by side watching it, not touching, not speaking, for 4 full minutes, and it was the least lonely Jonah had felt in years. He had not asked her to dinner. She had not withdrawn the transfer request, but she hadn't pushed for it to be processed either, and they both understood the meaning of that silence without discussing it. They were standing at the edge of something. Both of them aware of it. Neither of them willing to be the one to look down first. It was Deja who named it. Saturday morning, same ritual, Layla with tea, Deja with laundry, the phone warm against her ear. "You like him," Deja said. "Not a question. It's complicated." Everything worth anything is complicated, Layla Christine. He said what he said. She set down her mug. I can't just. I'm not telling you to just anything. I'm telling you what I observe. Deja's voice was careful and precise the way it got when she was saying something important. You've talked about him in 4 consecutive phone calls. You described the way he looked at the rain. You used the word undefended. A pause. When is the last time you used that word about a person you didn't care about? Layla was quiet. Outside her apartment window, Chicago was doing the gray and gold thing it did on November Saturdays, clouds breaking just enough to let the light through in long slanted columns over the rooftops. He comes from a world that was built to exclude people who look like me, she said finally. Even if he's changing, and I think he is, I actually think he is, that world doesn't change just because he does. His friends, his father, his whole infrastructure. I know, Deja said. I know all of that. I'm not minimizing it. A gentle pause. I'm just asking, is the fear of that world costing you something that belongs to you? Layla didn't answer. But she thought about it for the rest of the weekend. Monday arrived with a particular velocity that Mondays at Whitmore Capital always had, urgent, slightly aggressive, organized around the needs of people who billed in hourly increments that exceeded most people's daily wages. Layla was at her station at 7:15. By 8:03, Patrick appeared in the prep room doorway with his carefully neutral expression deployed at a higher intensity than usual. Mr. Whitmore needs you to know there's a situation, he said. What kind of situation? The kind with a journalist. Her name was Renata Voss. She wrote for a financial culture publication that operated at the intersection of business news and social commentary, the kind of outlet that powerful people monitored with the careful attention of people who understood that narrative was its own form of currency. She had spent 2 weeks working on a piece. The piece was about Jonah Whitmore. More specifically, it was about a quote, sourced from someone at a dinner, attributed to a guest, described in enough specific detail to be unmistakably him, in which a prominent Chicago CEO had made a colorism-based comment about the type of woman he would and wouldn't consider marrying. The piece was going to publish Thursday. Renata Voss had reached out Monday morning for comment. By 9 a.m., Jonah's PR team was in his office. By 9:45, his father had called from a family estate in Lake Forest, and that conversation had lasted 11 minutes and contained, by Jonah's count, 0 questions and 11 directives. By 10:15, Brooks had sent a text that said only, "I'm sorry, man. I didn't think Simone would." Jonah read the text once and put his phone face down on his desk. He sat very still for a long moment. Then he did something that surprised Patrick, surprised the PR team, and would have surprised his father enormously. He asked everyone to leave his office. And he sat alone with it. Layla found out the way she found out most things in this building, not from the people who should have told her, but from the ambient information that traveled through the floor like weather. Amara texted her at 10:58, "There's something going around about Whitmore and a journalist. Something about a comment he made. About a dark-skinned woman. Layla, I think it might be about you specifically." Layla read the text in the service corridor. She put her phone in her pocket. And for a long still moment she stood in the hallway, near the same glass partition, the same fluorescent hum overhead, and felt the specific exhausting grief of someone who had almost let themselves believe, and is now confronting the cost of almost. Almost, she thought, is the most expensive word in the English language. She thought about the prep room. The succulent on the windowsill. 4 minutes watching rain. Don't waste it. His mother in Tennessee. Her mother's voice saying don't let anybody make you small. She thought about the wall with the window in it. Then she went to HR and asked for her transfer to be processed immediately. Jonah found out at 11:43 when Patrick knocked and said, Ms. Monroe resubmitted the transfer request. Effective end of week. Jonah stood up from his desk so fast his chair rolled back and hit the credenza. Patrick took a half step backward. Where is she? Jonah asked. I believe she's. He was already out the door. He found her in the executive lounge. She was packing the last of the supply inventory she was responsible for handing off, methodical, efficient, armor so fully assembled it was practically architectural. She heard him come in and did not stop what she was doing. You heard, he said. Yes. Layla. Don't. Her voice was controlled and quiet, and it cost her visibly. Please don't do the thing where you explain. I can't do the explaining part right now. Then just listen. He moved into the room and stopped at a distance she hadn't told him to close. I know what this looks like. I know what you're thinking, and you're not wrong to think it. He exhaled. But I need you to know what I've decided. She stilled, kept her back to him. I'm not going to issue a strategic non-apology through a PR team, he said. I'm not going to let my father's communications director craft a statement that protects the brand and buries the substance. I'm going to talk to Renata Voss myself. On the record. And I'm going to say the thing clearly. What I said was wrong, where it came from, what I've been forced to examine in myself because of it. A pause. Not to protect myself. Because it's true and because the people it hurt deserve the truth said in public with my name on it. Layla turned around slowly. Her eyes were bright in the way that eyes get when someone is refusing, through sheer force of self-respect, to cry. That's going to cost you, she said. I know. Your father. I know. Your friends, your... Layla. His voice broke slightly at the end of her name. Just slightly, just enough. I know what it costs. I'm choosing it anyway. He looked at her steadily, with no boardroom left in him at all. I'm not asking you to forgive me on a timeline. I'm not asking you to feel anything you don't feel. I need you to know that you did not imagine what happened in that prep room. What you told me. What I told you. That was real. And I'm not going to let fear make me act like it wasn't. The room was very quiet. Chicago pressed gray and gold against the glass. Layla looked at him, this man cracked open and ungoverned by everything that had previously governed him, and felt the window in her wall blow open fully in a wind she hadn't prepared for. You're going to lose clients, she said softly. Your father is going to. My father built a frame, Jonas said. I'm done living in it. She crossed the room. Not fast, deliberately, with the full weight of conscious choice in every step. She stopped in front of him and looked up at him, and he looked back at her, and neither of them performed anything. I'm terrified, she said quietly. So am I. I don't trust easily. I know. I'm going to earn it. That's not a short process. I'm not going anywhere. Her eyes searched his face with the accuracy she brought to everything, looking for the performance, the leverage, the careful management of impression. Finding none of it. Finding instead a man standing in the rubble of his own inherited architecture, choosing to build something true from the pieces. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, briefly, gently, the way you touch something you're deciding to trust with your most careful self. He closed his eyes. Breathed. When he opened them, she was still there. Don't you dare waste this, she whispered. Never, he said. Not for anything. The Renata Voss interview published Thursday morning. It was not the piece Renata had originally planned to write. Because on Tuesday afternoon, Jonah Whitmore had sat across from her in a conference room with no PR representative present and said, with his name fully attached to every word, that the comment attributed to him was accurate, that it reflected a system of belief he had inherited and never examined, that the examination had been painful and necessary, and that he was stating publicly what he had already stated privately, that the woman it had been about was not too dark for anything, that she was extraordinary, that the failure had been entirely, completely his. Renata Voss, who had been writing about powerful men for 11 years and had become somewhat clinically detached from the possibility of being surprised by them, sat back in her chair and looked at Jonah Whitmore for a long moment. That's an unusual statement for someone in your position, she said. I'm aware, he said. Your father is going to hate this. My father hates a lot of things that turn out to be right. The piece she published was titled, What It Takes for a Man to Change His Mind. It was not a takedown. It was not a puff piece. It was something rarer, a precise and honest account of a man confronting the infrastructure of his own bias in public, with no strategic benefit and considerable personal cost, because someone had shown him what his carelessness had cost her and he had chosen to be accountable for it. It was shared 40,000 times in the first 6 hours. Jonah's father called at 7 a.m. Thursday. The conversation lasted 22 minutes. Jonah let him say what he needed to say, all of it, the anger and the disappointment and the language of brand and reputation and what the family had built. He listened with the patience of a man who has already made his decision and is simply giving the other person the courtesy of being heard. When his father finished, Jonah said, I love you, Dad. And I'm not going to keep carrying the parts of your world that were never mine. He hung up, sat for a moment in the quiet of his office, then sent a text to his mother that said only, "I think I found the room." She replied in 30 seconds with, "I know, baby." She sounds like someone who deserved to be found. The succulent was still on the prep room windowsill. Layla had decided to leave it there. She had withdrawn the transfer request on Wednesday morning, quietly without announcement, the way she did the things that mattered most to her. Patrick had seen it in the system and had allowed himself, alone at his desk, a small and unprofessional smile. On Friday evening, Jonah found her in the prep room at 6:50. She was watering the succulent with the focused tenderness she brought to small living things. He leaned in the doorway. "There's a reservation at Oriole," he said. "Saturday. 7 o'clock. And I made it myself, no connections, just a phone call and a 4-month wait that I started the day after I found out you'd heard me through that glass." Layla looked up. "4 months ago," she said. "The week after the conference room." He held her gaze. "I didn't know if I'd ever deserve to use it. But I wanted to be the kind of man who had it ready if I did." Something moved across her face, the specific expression of a woman receiving evidence that a man has been quietly becoming someone worth believing in, and finding the evidence, against her better defenses, completely and utterly compelling. "That's a lot of faith in yourself," she said. "It was faith in you," he said simply. "That you'd be worth becoming better for." She wore deep burgundy. He wore charcoal with no tie, the first time in recent memory he'd entered a restaurant without the full armor of his professional presentation, and it felt like arriving somewhere as himself for the first time in years. They sat by the window. Chicago glittered below them, the lake dark and wide and patient in the distance, the city lights making their familiar constellations against the November dark, the world continuing its ordinary beauty entirely indifferent to the extraordinary thing happening at table 7. They talked for 3 hours. About her mother, who had started a new treatment protocol and was stubborn and funny and had made Layla promise to stop sending money she couldn't spare. About his mother, who had told Jonah the full story of his father's unlearning and how it had taken grace and time and a refusal to stop expecting better. About Terrence's architecture thesis. About the lake in the early morning before the city woke up. About the first meal that ever made them feel fully at home. For Layla it was her mother's oxtail, the low-end slow Sunday version, the one that meant you are safe, you are loved, you are home. For Jonah it was a grilled cheese his mother had made him on a Tuesday when he was 9 years old and had come home from school having been told by a teacher that he needed to be something. Less loud, less present, less. His mother had made the grilled cheese and sat across from him and said, "Don't you ever make yourself less for anyone, you hear me? Not for anyone." Layla looked at him across the candlelight when he told that story. "She sounds extraordinary," she said. His own words from the prep room returned to him. "She'd love you," he said. "She'd absolutely love you." At the end of the evening, on the sidewalk outside Oriole with the November air cold and clean and full of the smell of the lake, Jonah turned to Layla. He didn't reach for her hand or manufacture a moment. He just stood with her in the honest cold and said what was true. "I know this is the beginning," he said. "And I know you have every reason to take it slow, and I know trust is earned over time and not over dinner. I know all of that." He held her gaze. "I just want you to know that I am fully and completely here. And I'm not going anywhere. And I will spend whatever time it takes proving that the man in that conference room, the careless, blind, inherited version of me, I left him in that prep room the night you told me not to waste it." Layla looked at him in the cold amber light of the Chicago street. 34 stories above them, the 42nd floor of Whitmore Capitol glowed quietly against the sky, the floor where she had heard something that tried to take something from her, and where she had chosen, against every reasonable instinct, to stay. To do her job. To keep moving. To be extraordinary in a building that hadn't been looking. Until it was. She stepped forward and took his hand, deliberate and unperformed and completely, entirely hers. "I told you," she said softly, looking up at him with those eyes that read everything accurately and had decided this time to read hope. "Don't waste it." He held her hand like it was something he intended to keep. "Never," he said. "Not for anything." Above them, Chicago blazed. The lake breathed in the dark. And Layla Monroe, who had come from Vine City with 2 suitcases and 3 months of savings and a mother's voice in her chest saying don't let anybody make you small, stood on a Friday night sidewalk in the city she had chosen, holding the hand of a man who had chosen to be better, and felt something she had been careful with for a very long time. Not small. Not invisible. Not to anything. Just herself. Fully, completely, beautifully herself. And that, in the end, was the only love story that had ever mattered. She didn't need him to save her. She needed him to see her. And when he finally did, really did, past the glass and the armor and the inherited blindness and the 14 months of invisibility, what he saw was so extraordinary that it changed him permanently. That's what real love does. It doesn't complete you. It makes you more honest, more accountable, more willing to demolish the frame and build something true. If this story found you in a place where you've been told you were too something, too dark, too loud, too much, too from somewhere, I want you to hear this. You were never too anything. The frame was just too small.